Hi, welcome back to Not an Audio Review channel where I don't review audio gear. And this is going to be a quick one over on camera 3. We're talking again about audio streamers. And this video is essentially a follow-up to my last one where I compared the Raspberry Pi with the Pi2Design 2.0 hat, that's this guy here, with the Wiim Ultra, the Bluesound Node 2021, and the Eversolo A10. And you can watch that last video to see how that came out, but the TLDR is that if you want something that just works and sounds good, you get the Wiim Ultra. If you want something that can rival much more expensive streamers in sound quality for a lot less money, is infinitely customizable and tweakable, and are willing to deal with suboptimal software and maybe a monthly subscription fee to get features you get for free with most other streamers, like Qobuz Connect and Tidal Connect, you can get a Raspberry Pi and an audio hat for it and optionally beef it out in 100 different ways from there. But if you're willing to pay for great sound quality, insane features, and a mostly intuitive operating system, that's when you go for the Eversolo. And I borrowed this Eversolo A10 from Andrew and the other kind folks at Bloom Audio. Much appreciated, guys. But one of the things I said was that the $4,000 price tag of the Eversolo A10 seemed like a hard pill to swallow when you would get the $1,400 Eversolo T8 streaming transport, which is almost the same features as the A10 except without the DAC or analog preamp, and then have $2,600 left over for a separate DAC, and there's lots of DACs for less than that which I think are better than the still very good DAC in the A10. I also said that you can even get the T8 and the Eversolo flagship Z10 DAC for $600 less than the A10, and you'd also get a headphone jack with that. Now I made a mistake in my last video. I said that IY, in his review of the Eversolo T8, said that the A8 sounded better even just as a network streamer, and in fact he said the opposite of that. I obviously misremembered and flipped that in my head. YouTube lets you edit out bits of videos, so I edited that part out of that video. So if you're confused because you don't remember me saying that, that's why. But in fact, he said that the T8 was better than the A8. So maybe it isn't worth spending more to get the A8 instead of the T8 if you're not going to use the DAC in the A8. But is it worth spending more to get the A10 if you're just going to use it as a network transport? Could somehow all that extra money be worth it over getting the T8 and a separate DAC? Anyway, I finished the last video saying I would stick with the Pi, which I love and think sounds almost as good as the A10 for literally a tenth of the price. Except with Eversolo I could get not only Qobuz Connect without an additional subscription, but truly lossless Apple Music thanks to a workaround that Apple Music has, and I'm already getting Apple Music with my Apple One subscription, which it doesn't make sense to cancel. So I could actually save money by canceling Qobuz Connect. So I broke down and ordered the T8. Actually, I've had the T8 for a few days now because it takes me a while to make videos. I have a day job and kids and stuff, but don't forget to like and subscribe so I can get big enough to be an internet billionaire one day. And I've been switching back and forth between the T8 and the A10 here, which I have to return soon, and I can't hear a damn difference. Like the coax on the T8 doesn't sound as good as the I2S, in the same way the coax on the A10 doesn't sound as good as the USB. Which, remember, with I2S and USB, my DirectStream Mk 1 DAC uses its own internal clocks to keep the thousands of samples per second in line, whereas with coax I'm using the streamer's clocks. But as far as I can tell, coax on the T8 sounds like coax on the A10, and I2S on the T8 sounds like USB on the A10. Like, maybe there's a difference, but if there is, it's so small that I can't confidently say there's a difference. Now, I don't necessarily have the highest end, most resolving gear. I've got the DirectStream Mk 1 DAC here, and the modded whammy amp I built myself with the Sparkos op amps, and a Parasound A23 power amp, and my Q Acoustic Concept 30 speakers. So maybe on a different system, a more resolving system, maybe you'd hear a difference. But I can't. So if you are considering getting the A8 or the A10 to use just as a streaming transport, and don't need or want any of the other specific features those have, get the T8 instead. One thing to point out though, I thought the T8 had DDC functionality like the A10, but it doesn't, so you can't input USB into here and output other protocols like coax or I2S. But there's some things I like about the software here over the A10. Like in the A10, you tap streaming, and then you get your streaming services and you have to scroll down to get to the apps. And that's how you get to the Apple Android app to do the truly lossless audio. Whereas on the T8, you just tap apps, and there's your Apple app. as opposed to the streaming tab where you have the streaming version of Apple Music there. So that makes it a lot easier to go straight to the Apple app that you want. Meanwhile, everything I said about the sound quality of the A10 versus the other devices I tested in the last video holds up. So if you haven't watched that, you can go watch that for a full rundown. But yes, I think the T8 sounds better than the Wiim Ultra, the Node 2021, and the Raspberry Pi with the Pi2AES hat, though the Pi solution gets close and costs much less, though only about a third as much as the T8 rather than a tenth as much of the A10. But Eversolo gives you a more usable operating system, better access to streaming services, and other software features you don't get with the Pi. And the T8, like the A10, the A8, and the A6, has bays for SSDs, so you can use it as a music server. Over here on camera 4 now, and there's one more thing I want to bring up about streamers that I didn't bring up in the last video. If we come around back to my DirectStream DAC, you can see I actually have another streamer I didn't mention in the last video. This is the PS Audio Bridge 1 card, which slots into the DirectStream DAC and turns it into a streamer DAC. And it would be great. I wouldn't need a separate streamer, just one box. It has a couple of problems though, which is why I didn't include it in the rundown. Now it doesn't have Wi-Fi, which isn't a huge problem because I have the Wi-Fi repeater. In fact, I originally got the repeater to try this card out, and then once I had it, realized how much it improved the reception in my Pi, which used to frequently drop out over Wi-Fi. But it also doesn't support any streaming services. None. You can do UPnP to stream your own music from a local server, or plug stuff in with the USB port, but there's no Spotify Connect, Qobuz Connect, Tidal, LMS, Rune, nothing like that. Now this was rectified with the Bridge 2 card that replaced it, so I could buy that, but the Bridge 1 card simply can't do it. And this illustrates something important about streamers. If you have an amplifier from the 1970s, it might need a bit of refurbishment, caps replaced, and so on, but it'll still work today. There's people out there still using amps from the 1940s. You can hand your amplifier, like your passive speakers, your turntable, and so on, down to your children and grandchildren. But a streamer, because it's based on software, is a different story. Now, most streamers do support software updates, but just like on my computer, one day Spotify might come out with a version of their app that isn't compatible with the old operating system that runs on my old computer. So it's probable that in 10, 15 years from now or whatever, any of these streamers won't do what you want anymore. And just like the Squeezebox streamers that Logitech made until 2012, one day the company that makes any of these streamers might discontinue them, or the company might no longer exist to provide software updates at all, and any network services run by those companies will no longer work. And that's just something you have to be aware of when considering these devices and making your cost-benefit analyses about which one to buy and how much money you want to spend. And that's it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.